So hopefully everyone can see the slides as well. I'm just going to start and welcome everybody. We're discussing today, it's just an office hour session, so mainly it'll be open discussion. Talking about what a potential Q command v2 might look like. In particular, what we're going to be going through is the analysis of what Q command itself does today. So as I said, we're just going to start with a sort of a brief intro to frame things, perhaps for those folks who are not familiar with what Q command is, but also just as a way of sort of getting on the same page as to what we're actually talking about and what we're not talking about as well. Please jump in at any time. This is designed to not be a monologue. So this is exactly that. We're going to talk about what Q command is, why we're talking about a potential v2, what the scope of that could be, a sketch of the potential sequencing of where we go from here, and then just dive straight into the analysis of what Q command does today, and then just open it up to discussion for folks. So what is Q command? Q command is a way of wiring up declarative workflows. I kind of like the phrase wiring up there because it sort of points to dependencies and data flows between different things that need to happen. So it's all about declaring what needs to run and the dependencies, inputs and outputs between those, and indeed any constraints and data transformations that should be applied at the same time. As things stand today, we have Q command, which is a tiny bit confusing because Q command is part of command Q. So apologies if I make that stutter the whole time. But Q command, as it's in the title here, is what I'm referring to as being the way, that's the thing within which we run workflows. And those workflows are declared as, again, very confusingly, commands. And those commands are comprised of tasks, i.e. the things that need to happen. Those tasks might include things like executing of commands, making network calls, interacting in some way with the workflow's environment, i.e. where the workflow is being run. And those tasks are built on top of a standard library set of primitives that we have. For example, exec run is a way of running a CLI. This is how we run a workflow via Q command, my command. So lots of commands here, and I think that's possibly a bit of mental feedback to take for us here. There's too many commands being mentioned all over the shop. Anyway, just at a very broad sort of architectural level, Q command exists in the tooling layer. That is to say, it's not pure evaluation, at least as we understand Q today. In fact, it's multiple repeated evaluations, and workflows are designed to have side effects. I sort of like a way of saying we've got this configuration that we have perhaps validated. Everything's sort of been chucked into the bag. Now we want to do something with it. So that's principally the reason that this kind of thing exists, hence why it sort of sits in this tooling layer. So here's a very simple example. This is actually taken from the qlang.org site, where we're reading a file as sort of taking some sort of input here, and the contents are read into the contents field of read file. Then we're just going to echo a greeting via cli.print, as in just output something to the terminal, where we're just taking a transformed version of the contents that we read. So we're just trimming spaces there in a sort of rather boring way. And then we're just going to thank the user at the end there. But there are a couple of dependencies that you can see going on here. This is a very primitive way of highlighting those dependencies, the red being sort of the source of the dependency, the green being the target of it, if my language isn't back to front there. And it's in this way that this is what the wiring up is, right? It's these things need to happen, and the wiring up is, I should really have perhaps put strings.trim space in some other color as well. We're also applying transformations in here as well. And of course, there's no policy here, but this just being Q policy could sort of be being applied here in any way, shape, or form. For example, we might apply some sort of constraint to the contents of the file that we've read, as in it must such that, oh, I'll try that again. The constraint might be the file must start with shebang, for example, whatever it might be. And so we've got this nice sort of intermingling of the things that need to happen, constraints, transformations. And at the moment, the way that Q command works is that we use some sort of meta Q, for want of a better phrase, to express these tasks and the way in which the workflow is structured effectively. And then this is just for completeness, how we then actually run such a workflow. We call the command do stuff via Q command do stuff, and it prints things out in this order and will reliably do so based on the dependencies as has been declared between those tasks. So why are we talking about a potential Q command v2 here? I think there are a number of reasons. Is that when we've, over the years now, since Marcel created the first version of Q command, and more specifically this notion of a declarative workflow, is where Q really clicks for people. They see it as a much more natural way of declaring work that needs to be done. I think as well, judging by the responses that we've had to 13.25 and the analysis, thank you to everyone who's engaged, especially more recently in terms of kind of what should we be considering here. There's general interest in it, and I'll come on to the third point in a second. Another reason that we need to look at Q command v2 or some fixing of Q command is that there are a significant number of bugs and rough edges with Q command that make it such that advertising Q command, if I just sort of put this loosely more broadly, is tricky, because what you're doing is you're encouraging someone to run into those sharp edges or run into those bugs. And we've deliberately tried not to do too much with Q command, because on the other hand, we sort of reflect that it's one way of doing things. It might not be the best way. And so this discussion around Q command v2 is sort of trying to take all of those things and tackle them head on. The third point there, I think, is key as well. This concept of a schema-first workflow is a growing trend. It's actually not limited to Q command and Q at all. Just take anything out there. GitHub Actions, GitLab, anything sort of CI related is all about this declarative workflow. Dare I say, anything in the sort of the AI space with tooling, MCP servers, it's all about connecting things together using structured input and output with validation in some situations. And the list goes on and on there. We, generally speaking, in day-to-day have more and more of these workflows where we're looking to specify structure between the different things that happen as part of a workflow. So what is the scope of a potential Q command v2? Just to say upfront, this is absolutely an exploration. There's no conclusion made at this point here. So I think it's key, a really important point to say, this process will determine what the scope is, what should or shouldn't be in, etc. And as such, this question is entirely open as to what the scope should be. And I think it's part of looking at what we've learned from Q command, and indeed what we can learn from other things out there, some of which I just listed, that will help us establish what the scope of Q command v2 could or should be. So very much an open question. So then if let's just sort of suspend our sort of thinking about this for 1 second of like, well, okay, where are we right now? We're looking at some sort of analysis. What could a sequencing look like here? Well, I think looking at what we've learned from Q command, what we can learn from other real world systems out there is a critical first step before we get into sort of thinking about anything like design, etc. And so this analysis phase is an important bit. We've had lots of great feedback. Let's just get a first cut of that analysis and start from there. Then I think it's probably iterative, where we can, in parallel to that, some folks might have some ideas of what designs might look like for Q command v2, things they want to try out, etc. But I think it's good that we should be keeping in mind the requirements or whatever it is, and being sure that we've got the scope correct and all of this, and then just adjusting as we go. And similarly, once we actually sort of if we start to build some sort of momentum on this, and we're thinking, yeah, you know what, this has got some legs, then much like we did with the embed experiment, I think getting something experimental out there as quickly as possible is a really, really good thing. We got some excellent feedback on embeds, and indeed even parts of the module stuff where we got stuff out there quickly. We held it up against something like a design or just whatever, or a proposal, and so folks could critique either the implementation and or the proposal and design as well. So I think iteration here is absolutely key when it comes to all of this. Then we sort of naturally will, I think, get to certain points in this iteration where we sort of feel like it is a decision point of like, are we justified in what we're pursuing here with v2, or is it just really not that compelling? And as I said, we're not looking to prejudge that in any way. Let's just briefly just talk about the analysis that we have. As I said, we've been gathering feedback for some time now, since 13.25, and indeed before that, when Q Command first came out. It's just that I started rather more formally gathering that feedback in 13.25. Huge amounts of feedback, especially of late. Massive thank you to everyone who's engaged with that. And a number of issues and discussions linked from that as well. Joe, in particular, I'll call out your discussion, which has prompted a huge amount of great interaction on specific bits of feedback, where you very nicely laid that out. So thank you. What I've tried to do with 4081 is actually pull together an analysis of all of that feedback, bugs, etc. It's very much a first cut. And as I said at the top of 4081, I've deliberately tried not to polish this in any way, shape, or form. And instead, I've tried to, as faithfully as possible, represent what people have said, in perhaps rewording it slightly such that I can make sure I've understood what it is somebody said, but so that you can tie it back to either specific comments and issues. This office hours is the first discussion of that analysis. And so please provide any feedback on it, corrections, omissions, etc., either now or in 4081 or in private, if there are things that actually in some situations there are people want to sort of show real world examples that are just, it would be too time consuming to reduce down to something small. So the sections of analysis, again, I just went with some broad attempt at categorizing the bits and pieces that we've discussed there. This is by no means the final categorization, and shame on me, I put everything beneath these sections as bullet points to make it even harder for people to refer to specific things. I will fix that for the second cut, apologies, so that we can instead refer to section 5, item 4, or whatever it is, and quickly jump to it, rather than everybody having to sort of do some mental gymnastics as to which part we're talking about. I only thought about that once I'd published it. Really the next phase now, I'm going to be quiet and let's just open this up for discussion. These headings are perhaps areas which folks might want to jump in on, and or they might want to say, I think we've totally missed something here. So for example, we talked about it already, but how, where are workflows and tasks declared? We saw from earlier on that example that they have to exist in an _tool.q file in the command's namespace, etc. I really open it up entirely now to anyone to just jump in on any points, and we can sort of take it from there.
Yeah, I had a thought in my head about the structure of what a tool file, if that's even something that is going to be persisted, will look like. At the moment, there is sort of this vague schema of how you put tasks under commands, and then you can kind of have the actual tasks sort of nested several levels, and they somehow get flattened. Maybe I'm like wrong on that, but that's how it seems. And so it just seems to be like a lot of vagueness around how these tasks actually are structured. And I think some direction, either going with like a fully structured approach where we actually import a schema and we get type checked against it, or a completely unstructured approach where all that matters is that we define tasks that have this particular shape or a call to the standard library that then get flattened automatically. Whatever side of the spectrum it goes, just having something that we say, yeah, this is actually the way that we're going to define workflows.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tom. Joe, you also sort of picked up on this, if I can touch on some of the discussion we had in your analysis on Q Command, is that I think it relates closely as well to how dependencies are declared between tasks as well.
Right. And so for me, one of the things that I would really want to look for is the ability to kind of group tasks together and treat it as a single task, and then thread it together with other tasks. And so today, you kind of, if you want to control the sequencing of multiple tasks that are inside of another group of tasks, you have to pierce into it and know what the names of each of the individual tasks are, and include a done or after for the first or last task. And so maybe this is less of an issue for tasks that can all be run in parallel. And so this is, since that's kind of the default. And so the thing I would think about is, honestly, I kind of don't mind the kind of, I don't know how else to say, kind of loosey-goosey tasks can be anywhere underneath the command, and it'll figure it out and execute them. That's kind of seems okay to me. It gives you a lot of flexibility in defining subtasks and grouping them and creating the relationships between them that are kind of composable. But then the problem is you can't really take that unit and actually use it somewhere else without leaking the details of the contents. And so as far as the thing that I would be most interested in is composability in general.
Yeah, I think that also touches on another point where today there's not really a very good reuse story at all when it comes to either workflows or tasks. I mean, one of the things that sort of a number of folks said in the analysis is that we want to provide means of reusing tasks or workflows such that maybe the distinction between a task and a workflow actually disappears. It may be quite reasonable for me to say, I want to, from one workflow, call another workflow, at which point maybe sort of the walls collapse, essentially. But either way, and Tom, Joe, this I think touches on the same point, is that if we want to support, and I think it's a good thing, this reuse of tasks and workflows, we need to be clear how to reuse things, how to compose them as well, and how to have the dependencies. Joe, I think you touched on a great point there, in that where you want to compose things, it's tricky. Tom, you mentioned this, we're wanting lists of tasks. There's a real tension there, at least in sort of experience of things like GitHub Actions. It's like, well, I can't really work with composing lists of things there. It doesn't really work in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, recursive definition would be powerful. Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yep.
Can I change the direction a little bit with my curiosity?
Yeah.
So I have hopefully what I think are solid opinions on what V2 should be, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I would really love to know the history behind Q command. Like, why does it exist, and what was the original vision for it? Does anyone have that information? I want to share that.
Yeah, I can fill that in. It's actually very very, how to call that, like low level or silly. So basically, so at Google, even before Borg was designed, we basically said like you should never mix computation with configuration. But as we sort of figured out down the line that there are fundamental limitations where you basically, sometimes you just have to do computation and configuration. And the idea is, well, so basically Q command started out as an experiment. So what if we could interleave the computation and configuration? So basically have the configuration, but shell out to computation and mix it back in, because Q is composable, right? Because you have order independence, you can compose at will. We could derive computed configuration and mix it back in without having to do any kind of weird import statements or whatever, or all the things that will, break composability and analytics. And that was really the idea. The idea was of Q command was purely to show that that's possible, and that was it. There was no other thought behind it. And then it turned out, a lot of people would use it. Solomon Hike said, "I will never use Bash again. I'm only going to write Q," and all that stuff, right? So people really liked it, but it was never meant to be anything really. So or quickly be able to hack some some kubectl or Borg config or whatever, right? If you wanted to do something like that, that's really what it was intended for, like just some quick insertion of computations. But yeah, we see now that it can be much broader than that, basically. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, I was definitely curious. So thank you.
David, did you want to segue into anything from any sort of points that build on that, or back to your original point?
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely go down some of my train of thoughts. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Q is a natural fit. I have a mono repository, and being able to use that hierarchy and composition of Q values to get environment variables and other stuff into a single directory in order to execute commands it's a no-brainer. I don't see why everyone isn't doing this. So it then leads into the point, okay, we need to evolve Q command, or we have to build tooling on top of it to be a basic just or makefile replacement. And that's just scratching the surface of where I think Q command v2 could go. And I'm curious about other people's opinions here. Like, are you just doing this, or would you like something that would be a makefile replacement? Or, is anyone sitting here going, I want to destroy Bazel and replace it all with Q? Like, how far do we want to look into the future for where V2 could go, and what is people's appetite to be involved in something like that? That's a very broad question, but I'll throw it out there first for starters.
I mean, personally, so I don't have anything concrete except for maybe personal interest, and I see it can be a lot more than that, right? But just generating scripts, right? Like if you generate scripts, I always thought like, okay, it's either Go, which is very verbose, or it's Bash, which is unreadable, right? And it's like, oh, if only we had like some Q representation, like if only for that, right? Like being able to quickly crank out scripts and reuse parts of it and stuff like that. It's quite useful. So in general, also, like as I've learned more about Q myself over the years, right? Like it's some people say like, hey, it's like a propagator network, it's a confluent computation model, it's like this, it's like that, and all of this focus on parallel computation, right? So it seems that Q is very well suited for parallel computation. So building some more infrastructure around that seems quite useful.
Joe, I think I've linked to it from the analysis. You wrote some Q that was called make tool. .q, which if folks haven't had a look, I would encourage them to have a look at that, because I think that actually sort of brought to the surface a number of things, David, that touch on that question of, should it evolve, should it evolve to be something make or Bazel related? Do you want to chime in from your perspective there?
Yeah, sure. So I was curious. So I've been curious about Q for a while, and then I found the Q command, and it seemed very interesting. I've always done build systems and CI systems, and I am very annoyed by the lack of schema controls and poor parallelizability, etc. And so I thought I'd just make I had this project, that web server project that I'm making kind of for fun. And I want to build it on a bunch of different platforms and across with Docker images and a couple different packages, etc. And so I thought this might be an interesting use case for Q. So I went kind of, head first down the rabbit hole and figuring out how to do all this stuff with Q and with Q command and making it. Really, I focused on kind of making everything composable. So I have a composable test command that runs the tests on the project. I actually use an external. It's kind of an integration test style, and so it pulls up the web server, runs some HTTP requests on it, and then and reports the result. And so I can reuse this this testing harness for testing both the Docker image and the two different package implementations. And so I thought this was kind of cool, so I just kind of went all the way. And so this has basically replaced what I would use GitHub Actions for. And so it builds and tests and makes the distributables and builds and pushes Docker, etc. And that's all kind of at the end of the file. And then there's other like smaller components that I might want to run in a smaller loop myself, so I might want to build and test Caddy, for example, and that's a smaller component, and I can run that individually when I'm working on the Caddy integration. And so I kind of went as far as I could, figuring out how to get this to work with Q. And so I use a lot of, I guess it could have been one gigantic command, but I like that I'm able to take smaller subtasks out and like just run them on its own. And I think that from my experience with this, I think if we just had a few rough edges kind of polished off here, I think this kind of system would be really very, very usable as a replacement for GitHub Actions, and while being usable for what's kind of like a project task file. And I don't know how far you could take that, because once you have composability and say we were able to import tasks from the module registry, I feel like we could take that pretty far. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think a common frustration from some of the conversations I've had is that, we define things as GitHub Actions, and that's great when we push it to GitHub, but running them locally is almost a non-event. And now I know there are tools like Act, etc., but it's not quite the same. And then your GitHub repository has access to secrets that you may not have locally, and there's just all these different concerns that make it really painful. And even with that, there's tools like Dagger and Moonrepo, which all have their own unique format for defining how tasks and workflows should run. And I think in my head, it would be great if I am just defining these as Q, and the actual backend or whatever can just take that definition and run it for me. I think that would be a really powerful model. I really love the Messy project, which is using Q to do BuildKit LLB instructions, which I thought was fantastic. And it's like, that's just scratching the surface, I think, of some of the things that would be possible, and should definitely be front of mind as a V2 is coming forward. Yeah, thank you for sharing that link, Daniel.
That's a good call out. I'll make sure I include that. I've got the transcription going, so I'll make sure I'll include that in the V2 of the second cut, I should say, the analysis. Someone just put their hand up. Nick.
Yeah. Hey, how's everybody going?
Good.
I've kind of waited patiently. I don't want to speak too much because I do tend to do that, but I've been kind of focused on using Q for literally my entire existence. Not even dipping into any other language, not even Go. What does it look like when one fully architects their entire life data profile inside of this language? From shell scripts to cron tabs to literally every part of the computer, plus my own external day-to-day things, my notes, my journals, my everything, right? So that's a lot of domains, right? And Q has done a phenomenal job so far of being able to help compress and compose those domains, I think. And I think you guys basically have it all on the table. It's just at this point, essentially this is where I see this project going, mainly because of the Plan 9 heritage, I think. I don't know to what degree it was there, but it seems to be like everything is already here. We just need to put it all in the right place. And I just can't help but feel that separating components is just making things difficult. So having export, eval, def, these are useful, yeah, very useful. But it's whenever you're a newcomer, if we really want this thing to be fully usable, then we can't educate people on a command line and a syntax and the semantics of the syntax and a non-hermetic build system, right? It just kind of muddies the water for your really, really newcomers, right? Which if we're not trying to target necessarily those people directly, and that's supposed to be like what people who like what projects who use QLang do, then more power to us. If we're really just targeting devs of like Python and TypeScript libraries, then more power to us on that. I just really think there's this concept of like merging the entire project directory and getting a new command line out of it. Like if I have a project from person A and it's got some TypeScript dependencies, it's got some Python dependencies, maybe it's got some Zig dependencies as well. And then this other project that has some Lean dependencies and some Rust dependencies and some TypeScript dependencies, right? I should be able to like use QLang in my eyes to like take those two projects, overlay them on top of one another and see what the dependencies collide, like see where most of these things collide. Like if are these TypeScript dependencies going to collide before I even try to merge these projects? Where are these like different code bases different? Right? Like if we're talking about Q as a lingua franca, then that means it goes both ways, right? So Q should be able to technically read the entire code base, right? If it has an encoding out to that language, then it should have a way to come back, right? I don't know very much about all the details, right? And the theory, and I'm still very much like getting my own knowledge set. But I really just wanted the ability to like actually have a code function that is represented in Go and in Q in raw syntax in my project. And when I update the Q definition, it imprints the Go definition back out to disk, right? And so I sort of keep a synchronization between the Q representation of literally whatever, schema, data, function, right?
Nick, one thing I'll pick up on in what you just said there briefly is I think there's two parts to that, at least as I heard it. One, and I've captured this in the analysis, is this idea of you said it a slightly different way to me, is that having the ability to write Q export in the form of a workflow. As in that kind of thing is a very powerful concept, because what that gets into talking about is it being possible in a workflow, for example, to be quite precise and explicit about what things should be loaded, and then how they flow into subsequent tasks. I think that's actually, sorry,
just real quick. I'm happy you brought that up, because that's actually what I did in syntax. I made my own little like module runner thingamabob inside of QLang, and then that thing had its own imports that you could either declaratively specify it as like a string path, and then I would go and look up the task in the current Q structure with Q. Like it was just an open struct. I would go navigate to that path and I would pull out the task, and then I would fill that task and it would run.
Yep.
I was going to implement that in the Go, but anyway, the module provided its own internal tasks, and I provided the mechanisms, right? So you guys are providing the mechanisms, right? And then you provide a couple pre-filled tasks, which are export, eval, blah, 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 right?
Yes,
that use your mechanisms and already provide an example of how to use the mechanism, right?
Yeah, so I think that's the thing, is that one of the key parts is that this is brought out in a number of different ways in the analysis, is that the way that that a workflow declares what its inputs are and what things need to be filled in is not very good right now. As in, whereas a task is sort of at the other end of that spectrum, where a task is very explicit about what its schema in and out is, workflows are not. And related to that is, what is this workflow working on? I'll just keep that super vague and loose. Is it some Q instances or whatever? That's a bit weak at the moment, to my mind, because we have this notion of being able to specify command line arguments. It's not always clear how they are mapped to things, etc. Right? So, and we're just leaving a lot of power on the table there. So that's the first part that I heard from what you said, and so I think that is a point that's well received, such that command Q, here we go again on the whole command thing, the export, eval, def, etc., they are not set in stone either, just to be super clear about this. They are evolving beasts as well. And so I think to your broader point of could or should it be possible to write those commands in terms of workflows? Quite possibly. And I think that would also drive home like a principle that we've operated on, and I just want to make this point out loud, is that anything that we implement in command Q should not depend on internal packages. This is something that we've had as sort of like a stated goal. It's not something we've achieved right now, but fundamentally it should just be building on non-internal primitives that others could implement their own thing on, right? And that's actually been sort of a key part of the power of all of this, is that there's nothing internal there. It shouldn't depend on anything internal. And so I think that would add weight to that point as well. Steve, I see your hand up. I was just going to acknowledge the second half of what I heard from Nick, which was this idea of Q as an interlingua. I absolutely think that's related. I think it's somewhat largely orthogonal in terms of Q's ability to be an interlingua between different things, definitely supports the workflow stuff. But it's something that can sort of evolve and should evolve sort of separately, as in there's not an existence dependence between those two, but definitely what one can do, as you're alluding to there, Nick, because Q is an interlingua, in the workflow space is very much enhanced by its ability to speak 20 languages instead of 10, for example. So I would completely agree with that. Sorry, Steve, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Slightly different angle from, I think, Nick's more galaxy brain take on this. To my mind, this all feels extraneous to the Q project. And I don't mean to throw too much cold water on it, but I think what we're describing here is, it reminds me of building like a tenth of Bazel, or it overlaps a little bit from what I've seen you can do inside of New Shell, like it's been gluing and massaging data between programs. Keep in mind, I love Q. It's been here for a while, but this feels like a project that should sit on top of, next to Q. Like it feels to me like the development team has enough going on and enough to worry about that it's not clear to me yet how getting this more closely into the project or the language or the runtime, whatever, is going to benefit people's ability to understand the language and why it exists and how to use it.
Sorry,
Lots of other high-powered hands. Go ahead.
No, please. Just before anybody else replies on that, can you just say again, Steve? You referenced something shell. I just want to make sure.
Oh, sorry, New Shell. NUSHELL.
Perfect. I did hear that correctly. Yeah. Thank you. Again, I'll make sure that we sort of include some reference to that in the analysis as well.
So
Roger,
I feel like I'm just not getting it. You know, when you said about how this makes it click, like Q clicks for me without any of this. So I want to hear more. What am I missing?
Just before anybody else responds on that, I'll also say that Judson Lester, who also got involved in the 1325 issue, has a similar sort of take on things. And I think it just to add support to you raising that question, right? I think it's an important question to try and challenge, to understand how these things relate to each other. What is the relationship between them, and why are we doing them? So I think I sort of fall into sort of various different camps in this, but I just wanted to say I think that's a perfect question to be asking, and falls squarely into the category of what should the scope be here. You know, and the scope could be, in answer to your question, the scope should be 0 because ... this lives elsewhere. And I think that sort of is supported in some respects by the fact that, as I just said, Q command as it exists today does not exist sort of in Q. It's sort of in this tooling layer on top, right? And I think that's in part sort of a nice property, that there isn't this intrinsicness to it, that it can be built on top. But I don't think to sort of say the opposite side of it. I don't think that implies that it can't be part of the Q project. I think you're raising the relevant question, though, of should it be? And then we've got to fill in a really good answer there. But I'll leave others to. I just wanted to add support to you raising the question.
Certainly uniquely qualified to implement such a tool. But I just remember even from very early on learning the term, the tooling layer, and then knowing that there was this partitioning of where your understanding of how things work had to recognize which side of that divide you were on. It's always kind of hurt to me.
Yeah, but I think that's good of you to bring that up. Is I think this was kind of Nick's point as well, is that there being these artificial distinctions between different parts is potentially unnecessary. It was something that was, to my mind, established early on in order that people could sort of consider this bit as being hermetic and this bit as not being. Also other reasons as well, but maybe those sort of walls have somewhat collapsed. I've spoken enough, but I just want to say thank you for raising it, because I think it's a critical question as we come across this. Roger, it looks like you were first there.
Yeah, I just say that this is like a really good point, and I think that, to my mind, the Q command sits within a larger domain of what does it mean for Q to have effects in general. And the Q command is just like one. We want a set of commands that it can run, but there are a bunch of other ways that you might want Q to be able to interact with the outside world. You might want it to be, the current time to filter in, or all this kind of things. And I think that's a much larger scope. And I think there are that by layering on top, I think one precludes certain kinds of efficiency in terms of because what it's doing at the moment, it's actually traversing the entire configuration every time something happens, which is kind of fundamentally inefficient, right? It kind of has to do this n squared kind of thing in order to progress. And to my mind, if we have some kind of notion of effects or that kind of thing in the core, then you can more easily build efficient things on top of it, like Q command, like all the other kinds of things where you might want some kind of side effecty kind of things going on. And so I think from my point of view, what I'm looking for is both a primitive that we can build on and a design for whatever Q command itself becomes. I mean, that's just my own kind of goals, I suppose, my own point of view. But
so Roger, just to draw out what. Oh, sorry, please, Joe, go on. Yeah.
A question about the about n squared in particular. So I remember looking at the Q API a long time ago. It's a little bit fuzzy to me. I remember seeing a way to mix in additional Q values into the Q value, and to mix them together. And so I assume the way I would assume Q command works is it loads the structure, and then as each command runs, then that bit of structure is filled out, and then that's injected into the main Q value, and then we find the next thing, and execute that. Is that how it works? And
yep.
Is that actually n squared?
Well, that's how it works, but also producing more structure can also produce more commands. Yeah. So you kind of have to search the structure. I think it's kind of hard to do it. I mean, the way that ToolsFlow is defined is as a kind of search through all the nodes. So you'll give it a node and you'll say, is this a command?
It's much worse than that, actually.
Limit to how much more commands,
so let me correct that.
1 second. 1 second. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah.
So I guess I understand that there's not really a limit to if you complete a command, how much more work could be created from that. That's pretty clear. But I feel like that's kind of linear in.
Yes. So what Roger said wasn't correct and not a complete story. It's actually whenever you compute something, the entire tree is recomputed, like over and over and over again. So that's where the n squared is coming from. And then there's another, because we don't have fine-grained structure sharing, because workflows tend to have long chains of references, that's another factor of n. So then really it becomes n cubed. So it's extremely slow actually at the moment. And so basically at the higher level, to come back to Steve's question, this is a while back that I raised my hand, but to try to remember. Yeah, so is it important to the project? So yes and no, and this is something that we have to weigh, right? Like if it comes at the expense of the quality of Q, like we should seriously considering leaving it to somebody else. But on the other hand, it's also very fundamental to Q. And right now we're at this, so tying it all together, right now we're at a point, so we're looking at eval v4, we see the limitations of eval v3. It's going to be a much smaller step, by the way, from 3 to 4 than from 2 to 3. But one of them is to really make function calling like fundamental to the language and fundamental of to the model, and also express Q workflow as function calling, so that basically a workflow would be a single evaluation, not repeated evaluation, one for every task, right? And to have lots of outside control, even outside of the evaluator, like what is the order of evaluation of the evaluator, right? And that would so this is all so this is where Q flow or whatever you want to call it ties in very, very deeply with a very low level of the evaluator. And we need to solve these problems. There are several problems with disjunctions and several other things which all are related to this problem, funnily enough. So it's kind of a problem that needs to be solved anyway, right? And that would really really advance Q commands also quite significantly.
So just Steve, if I may, just to tie your question that you've posed there back to Roger's response, Joe's sort of additions to that, and Marcel's sort of the detail of eval v4 in there. This all comes under a heading rather clumsily that I've called something like, what was it? Oh goodness, now I can't see it. Functions, etc.
I need to complete it because it was so long ago. Just to say one more thing. So also the idea is, so Q command right now is quite complex. So you could say it is quite a distraction, but one of the ideas to get the core of Q command much, much simpler than what we have now, right? With removing a lot of these crazy things from overlaying parent directories, like remove all of that stuff, right? And keep something very simple and atomic, which makes it much easier than to build upon, right? Which makes it more close to the evaluator for the core team. And then make it easier to extend also from the outside, or more general.
Sure, Nick.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this one real short. This is mainly about how files and like paths and functions are fed to a workflow for myself. Like, I feel like the only way to legitimately do it is to just be able to specify it by like a query of some kind. Like, to be able to literally pull a function out of any single module that is like cached by like certain, like there should be definitely certain rules. Like we should be able to set policy on like which ones are possible, right? But like for me, having to specify an exact Q reference, right, like in actual syntax, has actually been kind of a problem, because sometimes I would like to template the path. Like I would actually like to come up with the path by some sort of QLang and then access that function, the actual function in the module. Does that make sense? And like those kinds of workflows are, to me, they're subject oriented, where like the subject knows parts of the path and then they get other parts of the path from other unions. And then they create the path that they're going to then go and get, if that makes sense.
When you're talking about a path there, do you mean like a a queue, like a path? Are you talking about a file path or a path?
I'm
to
talking
this?
about like a selector, like
Okay, selector. Yeah.
a full blown list of labels, I guess. Yeah.
So Roger, I think you sort of that section that I refer to in the analysis, which is functions, capabilities, etc. Sort of then, well, I think just to say this out loud, just so that maybe for others to agree or disagree with, this distinction that did exist with the tooling layer being separate and a sort of a separate thing is, it sounds like, sort of collapsing, for want of a better phrase, under the sort of the natural weight of what we've learned about the evaluator, function calls, etc., and the way that these things are actually much tighter, if not the same layer, albeit with some careful controls on what can or can't be done within an evaluation. Let me just sort of put it generally, because I think then that very naturally comes onto something else that was drawn out by Joe and a number of others in terms of, when I have a workflow, we need to be careful about what evaluating some queue can then do, that it only has desired side effects, and possibly those desired side effects might be zero. As in QVet, it is just validating that some data and some schema actually corresponds, right, in some valid way. But then as soon as you break that, and various folks have talked about sort of piercing the hermetic layer or whatever it is, I think that's a really good analogy. It's just like, as soon as you want to do that, what does it look like to allow that? How is that then enforced as well? And again, references that other folks have made to things like kernel level capabilities as a way of enforcing or creating jails around things. Some sort of the network layer, we imagine sort of like a policy-based thing that allows network calls to certain places, etc. So I think that's very, if we do collapse this down into some sort of more function-based thing, then I think that capabilities in sort of a non-Linux sense, a more general sense, is a really important thing in terms of expressing those capabilities, perhaps injecting dependencies. Joe, I think this is something that yours sort of very naturally did in your make tool example there, and then enforcing these things in some way as well. It is critical. So Steve, I don't know whether that sort of gives a bit of sort of insight as to, I don't want to say sort of justification for it, but how I think it's sort of naturally evolving to be something that is sort of a more core part of Q, but not required, as in, if you can sort of provide the function implementation and that happens to be executing this CLI in some way, shape or form, there's fundamentally less of a distinction between that and, for example, calling one of the Q standard library built-ins, like encoding JSON Marshall, for example. That one of them has side effects, the other one doesn't.
Yeah, I think I totally believe you that this becomes more ingrained in the working model of Q's implementation. You know, there might be some better synergy there, I guess. I think it's just important to know or recognize when to stop, because trying to satisfy all the community needs and ideas that they'll bring to this, again, just to look at precedent, the flourishing of Bazel rule sets and tool chains and all that stuff shows that people will drag everything they can find into this harness, and you can't take responsibility as a team of 5, 6, however many it is at the moment. You can't take responsibility to satisfy everybody's needs. Like right now, you know, you say we can print things, you know, we can run LS. That it's all very simple. It's gonna spiral out of control. So it's just good to know where to draw the line and say, from here, anybody else can come and build on top of this thing. It's kind of an equal partner, and we're done. Like, we built the bones, we built the spine. Everything else can come on top of that.
I think that's a really good point. I think it was captured in the Paul's analysis that, you know, at some point we should, and this kind of comes back to the point of like leaning on the module system. And so, maybe we can, enable a few basic primitives like calling executables, making network calls, etc. And then we stop and we let the module system handle it from there. And so, like, you can, if you want a specific capability to like work with call your specific command, or you want to call your web server with a particular API, well, that doesn't need to be in queue, and anything else doesn't need to be in queue. That could be in a module that you can import, and then the queue can run from that. And so I think that was highlighted in the analyses, and I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right challenge again, though, Steve, with all of these things as to what does that boundary look like. And I think, again, Judson picks up on this point as well as to what does that boundary look like. And my sort of mental model on this is that the Go standard library is a reasonable analogy in this respect, right? It provides certain capabilities, certain guarantees, etc., of the way things will operate. And I think, Roger, I don't want to speak for you here, but I think this is sort of fundamentally the point that you're talking about is, whilst today Q command is this separate beast here, perhaps those boundaries collapse such that it is just another function call, to pick up on Marcel's point there, that has a schema on the way in and a schema on the way out to massively oversimplify things, but just go with that for 1 second. But it's fundamentally the evaluator and the dependencies between things that, just as it does today, and the core evaluator defines how things evaluate and the success or failure, etc. It's just that we've bolted in this ability that has existed in some way, shape, or form already to do other things, right? And I think Joe described that nicely. Like, if we've got those right primitives, there's nothing to say that anybody has to do anything with them. It's entirely open to anybody else. And I think the modular ecosystem is in the right space to build on those primitives. And that comes back to points that Tom and Joe made earlier on, is that if we're clear on how people compose things and provide abstractions, or call them what we will, and then share them, and what those patterns for composition are, Q doesn't have to do anything at that point. That's entirely how that. But I think, so that sounds sort of like I'm disagreeing with your question. I'm firmly agreeing with it, because I think it puts us in exactly the right mindset for making sure we're sharp to that question of, okay, what is the boundary here? Thank you. We're somewhat at time, and what I should do is say that we should be respectful of the fact that everybody else has other calls and things. But what I will say in sort of conclusion to this session is that this is absolutely not going to be the only session if folks want to have other discussions on it. What I plan to do is a second cut of the analysis. So I'm just going to let that first cut of the analysis sort of soak for a few days. And if folks want to chime in the discussion with just things that come to mind, etc., that would be really good. Things that we've missed, other projects, new shell, whatever it might be that we should be referencing here to sort of make sure we've sort of got all the goods. I think that's probably a section that is missing, sort of prior art, really, with clear understanding of the relationship to that prior art. So let's include that. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining today, for all the contributions. Look forward to more of those, and very happy to organize another session like this in the future.